first of all, I want to say thank you so much again to Chastity Burns from Senator Durbin's office for being with us here today. And Chastity, if you wanted to say a few things before we dive into the presentation today, I would love to hand it off to you really quickly.
Thanks, Casey. Hi, everyone. I'm Chastity Burns. I'm Deputy General Counsel for Senator Durbin's Judiciary team. I'm really happy to be here and for us to have finally gotten out our Child Marriage Prevention Act. This is one of the first things that I worked on when I came to the Hill about 3 years ago, and we've been working diligently with incredible advocacy groups and most importantly, survivor groups on how to put together a meaningful and thoughtful bill that really takes important steps towards reducing child marriage domestically, as well as closing immigration loopholes that facilitate it. And so we're just really happy that we were able to garner the support that we have for the bill, as well as include Senator Gillibrand and Senator Schatz. And we hope to continue building our co-sponsorships and building our group endorsements and really getting the word out about the harms of child marriage and how we think that this bill can make a big impact on reducing it. So really appreciative to Tahare and to Casey for your assistance with the bill and for putting together this informative session where hopefully a lot of people can get their questions answered and hopefully choose to support the bill, which we hope to move forward. But thanks everyone for being here, and I'm just very excited for building the momentum on a bill that we think can make a real difference on an issue that's very important to Senator Durbin. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chastity. And yeah, I do want to recognize just the many years of work that have gone into this, your dedication to this issue, other staff on Senator Durbin's team. And Senator Durbin himself, of course, has been a champion of ending child marriage globally for over a decade now, has sponsored and co-sponsored many pieces of legislation and resolutions to end child marriage around the world. And we're really, really grateful to him for turning to our own backyard finally and taking some really strong steps to end and address child marriage on US soil. So excited to dive in, and also really grateful for the work that you've done across movements to get this bill to a place where we hope we can have broad support. But we're going to walk through the bill sort of section by section today because we recognize it's long. It's 46 pages of text. And that introduction happened very swiftly, which we are, of course, grateful for. But it doesn't give folks a lot of time to sort of wrap their arms around everything that's in here, and especially when we are making changes to the INA. Even for those of us who have long been doing this work, it takes a lot of time and attention to read through those, cross-reference with the INA, and make sure we understand what the bill is achieving. So happy to take the time today to walk folks through and answer questions. And we also have a section on frequently asked questions that we'll get to before opening up for Q&A at the end. So just to start with, we are not going to do what Tahare would normally do, which is a broad overview of the issue of child and forced marriage in the United States, but we're going to just dive in with sort of like the broad facts of the issue. And so to begin with, we're going to start with, child marriage on the domestic side. And so we have had lots of folks do lots of research over the years to try and get a good sense of how many child marriages are happening in the United States. And what we know now is that between 2000 and 2018, at least 300,000 minors were married in the United States. Right now, only states have the power to set a minimum age of marriage within the US. That is an area of law that is really reserved for the states. Back in 2016, all 50 states and the District of Columbia, which is not yet a state, but hopefully will be one day soon, allowed child marriage. 35 states have since made some progress to limit or end child marriage in the United States since 2016. And in fact, 13 of those states have ended child marriage completely, due in part to the efforts of many of the people that are on this session today, and everyone deserves their flowers for that. If we turn our attention to the immigration side of things, and this is certainly something Tahare has been seeing in our work, even before we launched the Forced Marriage Initiative, but we're working with asylum seekers and immigrant survivors of gender-based violence from abroad since 1997, and working with individuals who had been brought over to the United States as child brides and all the many harms that has caused them. And so we are, grateful that we now have some data to show us exactly the scope of that problem. So from 2007 to 2017, USCIS approved over 8,500 marriage-based visa petitions involving a minor. And currently, federal law, at this point, Congress has not taken a comprehensive approach or any action to address child marriage at home. And in the immigration legal realm, that is very squarely statute and an area of law that the federal government does have domain over and does have the ability to change. So what we know is that right now, there is no minimum age set out by statute for petitioners or beneficiaries of spousal or fiance visas. We did have an administrative policy win a couple of years ago when USCIS issued policy guidance, which requires consideration of the marriage age law in the intended state of residence of the couple. Though that is just one of many things USCIS is instructed to consider, we were grateful to them for adding that as something they do need to consider when deciding whether or not to approve or deny a petition. And it also confirmed that US petitioners had to be 18 at the time of petition in order to sponsor a spouse or fiance. And I think that came from a place of a lot of people in the immigration space thinking that was already de facto the rule because of the requirement to file an affidavit of support, which is a contract. And in the United States, only 18-year-olds can sign a contract. Unfortunately, what the data showed about USCIS approving visas is that US minors were slipping through the cracks of that assumption. And so with this policy guidance, it sort of made a more firm commitment that US petitioners do have to be 18 at the time of petition in order to sponsor. I will say, as with everything, and especially now in sort of the post Loper Bright Chevron deference decision, policy guidance and policy memos do not have the force of statute. And so even though we have this, guidance now, it is best even to sort of enshrine these kinds of changes in statute so that the next administration that comes along who doesn't agree with these rules can't just simply undo them with a new memo. So other things that don't currently exist under federal law are that there are no prohibitions on child marriage in really any area of law in the United States from a federal perspective, and there are no incentives or supports for states to make change at this time. And so it was from that place that we have been working for a very long time with Senator Durbin's office, as have many other advocacy groups from the immigration advocacy space and the movement to end violence against women, and many of those in the movement to end child marriage, to get to a place where we could have a bill that takes a comprehensive dual approach to ending child marriage in the United States and limiting it in the immigration system. And that was really important to many of us to take this intersectional approach. So we don't, with a single bill, only address the immigration issues and potentially, send the message that we are scapegoating immigrants and saying this is an immigrant-only issue, while also leaving out domestic survivors and ignoring their needs. And so seeing the ways in which all of these, sort of gaps in law intersect to double down on harm for minors, it felt really important for us to approach both in one piece of comprehensive legislation. Given the many different pieces of this legislation, it also sends a really strong moral message that what Congress wants, if this bill passes, is to see the end of child marriage in the United States. It encourages and incentivizes and supports states to end child marriage, and it closes protection gaps in federal law and makes commitments to continue to make progress on the issue in the future. So this sort of moral statement and this federal commitment, how are we achieving that in the bill? And so at the end of this webinar, I'm going to resend to everyone who registered the bill text, the section by section, and the one-pager. But what you'll find in those documents is more detail about the National Commission to Combat Child Marriage. National commissions are sort of a common approach to drawing attention from the federal level to issues that have been long ignored. It is one thing for nonprofits and research institutions and think tanks and survivors and others to write reports, as Tahirih and many others on this call have done, to do research, but it is another for the federal government itself to convene a national commission to bring what we know on this issue together and produce a report that makes policy recommendations to encourage the elimination of child marriage. So another really strong statement that this is what the federal government wants to see, and we're going to invest time and effort from our perch to make that happen. We also have the incentives and sort of rewards for states that have already ended child marriage. So this bill would authorize increased funding for states that already ban child marriage through increases to their Stop and SASP formula grants through the Office of Violence Against Women. And we would also take an approach of helping those advocates and others in states that have not yet been able to ban child marriage to support their efforts. So providing grants for state task forces to examine child marriage and develop policy recommendations to protect individuals from child marriage and related abuses. And I think the really interesting and powerful thing about the grants in this context are that they are meant to be task forces that are comprised of advocates with experience serving survivors of child marriage that, of course, can be inclusive of survivors. It is meant to include medical and mental health professionals, counselors that might have experience serving child marriage survivors. Again, in that space, there are likely to be child marriage survivors themselves, as we know from survivors that have come forward over the years. Many of them are doctors, many of them are mental health professionals, many of them are advocates in their own right. Child Protective Services, you name it, and bringing them together to examine areas of law, including age at marriage, but other areas of law as well that could be improved to better serve already married minors and help them get protection that they need and to prevent child marriage from happening. And so the state task forces are really intended to allow homegrown movements to end child marriage to thrive, and for advocates and survivors and professionals in states that have not yet been able to get to 18 to have the support they need, while also having that deep understanding of their own communities and the spaces where they work on how to get this done effectively. And the reports that they produce are encouraged to, recommend ending child marriage by setting the age of marriage at 18 without exceptions or higher if the age of majority is higher in that particular state. But they are also encouraged to make recommendations to other areas of law, like protection orders, making sure that protection orders in that state cover the types of harm and by whom that child survivors of forced marriage often have faced, so that they can avail themselves of civil protection orders, looking at DV shelter mandates so that maybe they can more readily accept older adolescent minors who are fleeing the threat of forced child marriage, looking at Child Protective Services, their mandates, their policies, their protocols, looking at divorce and annulment laws. So really empowering those on the ground who know their states best to think about all the ways in which we can better protect children from forced child marriage, age of marriage being essential to that effort, but also, again, encouraging this comprehensive look at lots of different areas of law that can be improved. And then something that I think really sends a strong message from the federal government is tasking the Department of Justice to promulgate, which means to just sort of share around and publish, model state statute, which instructs states to prohibit child marriage. So we have seen these in lots of different areas related to violence against women, related to, child protection, related to, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, you name it. And so sometimes when state legislators are looking at, I want to do this thing, I want to achieve this goal, I wonder if DOJ has a model state statute, they would find this and it would instruct them very simply to set the age of marriage at the age of majority without exception. And that sends, again, another really strong message that what the federal government wants to see, what Congress wants to see, is that states end child marriage in short order. It would also ban child marriage from happening on federal land and in federal buildings. This felt like the one area, it might seem like a small piece of the bill, but we have national parks and Smithsonian's and other pieces of land and buildings across the United States where weddings do often happen. We do know of at least one case where a child marriage survivor was married inside of a national park. And so this, I think, again, sends a really strong message that where the federal government has purview, they are not allowing child marriage to happen. And then we are going to move into the visa regulations. So we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail in a future slide, but this bill would set minimum age requirements for U.S. petitioners and foreign beneficiaries of spouse and fiance visas to prevent children from being married solely for immigration purposes, and a federal impact study. So it charges the Comptroller of the United States with studying and reporting on the prevalence of child marriage within the marriage-based visa program. So again, we have this sort of snapshot of data, 2007 to 2017. But for those of us, who know that the USCIS visa approval is not the be-all end-all. In fact, you also have to get final approval from the Department of State. And as yet, we have not gotten the data from the Department of State regarding how many of those visa petitions involving at least one minor were ultimately approved with visa in hand. We know that the rates of DOS approving visa petitions that come to them from USCIS as approved are very high. So the likelihood that the majority of those visas were ultimately approved by DOS is really high. We just don't know exactly the number. And it would be great to get updated data in that space to know just how many have been approved since 2017, and in particular, how many have been approved since the updated USCIS guidance came out. So again, not trying to duplicate efforts that have already been admirably done, but to add to them, to update them, and to keep our eye on the ball, because that kind of impact study and the other pieces of the commission are sort of ongoing efforts to monitor and study child marriage in the United States, which is a heavy burden. As many of us know, states are often reluctant to report data, really struggle to report data because things are decentralized, especially in states that often still rely on paper and don't digitize things. And I think that would really help to get states to take action to actually track and report data in a way that helps us, again, just keep our eye on this issue. And on that issue of states that sort of struggle, I think that also brings me back to the importance of the sort of state-based grants for the state-based task forces, and what we heard from states that have watch their legislators fail to take action, but the advocates and the survivors there, it is but for their efforts that the legislators have not taken action. Just providing the sort of boost in grant money to states that have already ended child marriage felt like, again, leaving them behind. And, oftentimes survivors and advocates and groups in states where their legislators really don't prioritize issues of violence against women, issues that affect girls, are often told, certain grant streams are not available to them because they haven't taken the correct action or have the right state-based policies on processing rape kits and other things. And so that was also an effort to ensure that those advocates and survivors in states where the legislators have been slow to take action are not left behind in our movement. Okay, and so the sort of more complicated part of the bill, but a part that I think Chastity and I have gone back and forth on many times over the years, and I really want to emphasize that, in this space of the bill, you are seeing the result of lots of different groups informing where the bill drafters landed. So it's not just those of us in the movement to end child marriage. It's not just, immigration advocates, but it's advocates in the movement to end violence against women. It's advocates in the repro rights space, in the, individual rights and liberty spaces. We are threading the needle through many different lenses on this particular piece of the bill. And I think that we have landed in an incredibly strong place with a commitment to continue this work as it moves forward. So right now, as I shared at the beginning, there is no age limit for U.S. petitioners or foreign beneficiaries of marriage-based visas in statute. The memo instructs adjudicators to consider state laws and the intended place of residence as part of like that broader set of considerations, and does require U.S. petitioners to be 18. But we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that that's policy guidance in a memo and doesn't carry sort of the force of having that in statute, and we want to see that enshrined in statute, so that cannot be easily undone. So this bill would set an age floor without exception of 18 for US citizens and legal permanent residents at the time of petition, if they're petitioning for a fiance and if they're petitioning for a spouse. And it would also go beyond the USCIS guidance and say that they also had to have been 18 at the time of marriage for that marriage to be valid for immigration purposes. That is a huge win for us. That is the space where the federal government can set a minimum age of marriage for those that they have jurisdiction over, US citizens and legal permanent residents, and this bill would do that. For foreign beneficiary fiancés, they have to be 18 at time of petition. There is no waiver for them. They are not married yet, right? Because they're fiancés, so there's no minimum age of marriage for foreign beneficiary fiancés. They have to be 18 across the board. For foreign beneficiary spouses, they have to be 18 at the time of petition. And there is no minimum age at time of marriage for foreign beneficiary spouses at this time. Despite recommendations that there should be, there was a lot of conversation around that from many different perspectives. And where we landed was right now there is discomfort around regulating age at time of marriage for people living in other countries. And while the sort of movements to end child marriage globally continue to do their work and continue to see progress, right? We saw Sierra Leone do this very recently. We will commit, and you'll see this later on in the requirements of the GAO report, to looking back on this in 1 year's time to say, should we actually, looking at the visas that were approved and the ages at time of marriage and time of petition that we're seeing, should we actually set a minimum age of marriage at 18 for foreign beneficiary spouses, so that we are ultimately, in the end, sending the message that we do not value US girls more than we value girls globally. And so those are ongoing conversations and an ongoing commitment to do that. But again, there was discomfort in setting an age in that space that wasn't 18. There was some conversation around, well, what if we don't do a bright line in that space? What if we do something like, that's more on the average of what we see globally? And that was really not something that those of us in the movement to end child marriage had an appetite for. So for age at time of marriage, we are committing to revisit that and hope to get that to 18 in short order. Age at time of petition for foreign beneficiary spouse is 18 with a very limited humanitarian waiver for 16 and 17-year-olds. And the way that that humanitarian waiver functions is that the Secretary of Homeland Security can grant a waiver in rare cases of compelling humanitarian need. To us and to many who work at the intersection of immigration and the movement to end child marriage, I will say, of course, with any bill, there are going to be areas where people lack consensus. I think I want to acknowledge that this is an area that does not have consensus from everyone in the movement to end child marriage. But for those of us who were, sitting and listening carefully to the folks that work at the intersection of immigration and gender-based violence, and listening to the voices of girls abroad who are consistently now really demanding that already married girls not be abandoned and left behind, we felt compelled that this is an area where we could have extremely limited flexibility in cases where someone's life and liberty are at risk. And we're thinking of, refugee camp settings, conflict zones, you name it. We don't want to necessarily completely shut down a potential last pathway to safety to an already married girl. But again, the GAO report does require us to investigate and interrogate the granting of those waivers and to consider whether or not the waiver should be eliminated and a minimum age of 18 should be instituted. So this is really a commitment to an incremental approach and represents, a pretty narrow compromise that we were able to strike with groups that don't necessarily all see eye to eye. There were some that were arguing for the humanitarian waiver to apply to fiancés and to spouses. We made sure it does not apply to fiancés because we feel that is a very different type of relationship than in a pre-existing marriage. There were some who didn't want to see the waiver have an age floor at all. But we, felt very strongly that at the very least, there are some UN documents, there is some consistency globally that, 16 is as low as we should go. And so we were able to set an age limit there in the waiver space, even though there were some that were arguing that there shouldn't be one. And so I will say, I think this represents an incredibly sort of responsible compromise, even though it is not the ideal. And ultimately, we want to see 18, no exceptions in all of these boxes. And I do believe that we will get there. And there is a commitment built into the bill to get us there. And with that, I just want to share my thanks to all of the endorsing organizations, and many of these are organizations that have worked for many years to inform Senator Durbin's staff and Senator Durbin himself on how to draft this. Many of you are on the call today, so appreciate that support, and I know that Chastity has already said that as well. And I also just wanted to move on to some frequently asked questions. Again, this is a complicated bill. It's a lot of text. And for those of you who may not have been at the table for all of the conversations all of the time, I totally understand. And so some of the frequently asked questions I am going to answer sort of proactively. And one, Chastity, you are welcome to chime in on this as well. Why has it taken so long to get this kind of legislation introduced? I hear you. I feel the same. I will say, for those of you who've been in this work, it took a long time for policymakers in the US to realize that when we speak about child marriage and we take action against child marriage globally, we cannot forget that the US is a part of that globe. Once that became obvious, and it became obvious that action was needed domestically, it took time to draft a bill with so many advocates from different movements invested in the outcome. And I will say we were very close. And then, as with all areas of our work, the pandemic interrupted a lot of our progress in many ways. So I don't know if Chastity, you have other comments on sort of the background on how we got here and what it took to get us here.
On top of what you said, Casey, I would just say that we have tried to be very thoughtful about how we write this bill. It's gone through many iterations. It's been improved over the years, even the small time that I've been here too. So we've just really taken a very thorough and thoughtful approach. I think that's been part of the delay as well, but a worthwhile process.
Yes, absolutely. Appreciate that, Chastity, and thank you for, as ever, sticking it out with us as we got this bill to a place where it could be introduced. One question that I've had asked a couple of times are the state task forces just rewarding states that haven't taken action to ban child marriage? And to that, I would say no. I would say state task forces like this are a commonly used tool to support advocates and survivors in states that are struggling to take action and to make progress with the funding and sort of technical expertise that they might need to get the job done in their communities. So again, they are not meant to be perceived as or intended to be a reward for states that haven't taken action yet, but they will provide support to advocates and professionals on the ground who know their communities and states best. They will be enabled to better be resourced to make the local case for comprehensive policy change to raise the minimum age and better protect against child marriage, those other areas of policy that I mentioned earlier. And I think many who have endorsed the bill and the bill drafters in Durbin's office really see these state task forces as paving the way for progress, not a reward for lack of action. And a big one, and I think this is one that Tahirih has struggled with over the years as well. And so I will admit that this is a compromise in the bill, but I think it is a powerful and important one with that will enable us to quell certain opposition while we move the bill forward with a commitment to revisit it. So why was a humanitarian waiver included? So again, in our movement, we must not really wholesale abandon already married girls facing potentially life-threatening situations overseas. The waiver acknowledges, as many in the immigration advocacy space have named for us time and time again, that in rare instances, there might be unforeseen humanitarian circumstances that warrant special consideration. There are lots of groups with lots of opinions on this issue, and after 6 years of drafting and negotiating, we didn't want perfect to be the enemy of the very good. Tahirih can support taking an incremental approach at this time while also negotiating text in another part of the bill, which requires a government accountability office. So I keep saying GAO, but that means government accountability office to report on the application of the waiver and make policy recommendations on whether it should be eliminated and a firm age of 18 set for foreign beneficiary spouses at the time of marriage and petition. Notably, the waiver, again, does not apply to fiancés, only to those already married, even though there were some who argued it should apply to fiancés and that it could have allowed the age to go even lower. We worked really hard to keep this waiver as narrow as possible and to set ourselves up to have the opportunity to eliminate it later. Does the humanitarian waiver undo state laws on age of marriage? I think overwhelmingly the answer is no. A limited humanitarian waiver in federal immigration law will not impact state laws on age of marriage. That said, while Tahirih, knows that state law on age of marriage and a waiver in federal immigration law will not, one does not undo the other, there is this USCIS policy guidance. And we do accept that in the rare instance, and when I say rare, I mean incredibly rare, those of us who work in immigration law, represent survivors, we know that these waivers are rarely, if ever, granted. I can't really emphasize that enough. And sometimes to really devastating impact. And so that said, it is intended to be used, and there is a chance that one or two or a handful may be granted. And when that happens, I do accept that when a waiver from the DHS secretary, is in the hands of a USCIS adjudicator, it is likely to be given great weight when adjudicating that petition. That said, the waiver is not fully instructive of granting a visa without also considering other factors. So the other parts of the USCIS guidance do still apply, though I do, fully accept that it is very possible that a granted waiver from the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security is likely to carry great weight when they are weighing all of those considerations. That said, again, given how few, if any, of these waivers are ever to be granted, I and many others do not feel that it is accurate to portray this as a wide open loophole. And then finally, I hope this is a question that is on folks' minds at the end of this presentation, and I'll let Chastity also make some sort of closing remarks. If you're interested and you want to get involved, what is next? So Chastity alluded to this, but I think where we have landed with this bill is a really elegant and sort of powerful compromise with lots of different interest groups that, for the most part, gets those of us in the movement to end child marriage 99% of the things that we have been calling for and demanding for years and years and years, with a commitment to take it fully over the finish line in short order, in 1 year's time, potentially. And so I'm excited about that. Many of the endorsing organizations are incredibly excited to get to work on next steps. And so what does that look like? Chastity, forgive me, but I have said email Senator Durbin's office if you want to endorse. We also have an endorsement link, but of course, organizations are welcome to take either approach. If you're a survivor advocate and want to be plugged into the campaign, please contact us anytime. That would be myself or Alex Goyette. Many of you already know him. And the next steps will be to remain in conversation with advocates about the bill, if there are ways it can be improved, if things can be clarified. We are all ears, and by we, I don't speak for Senator Durbin's staff. Senator Durbin and his staff are the ones ultimately with the pen, and I know that over the years they have kept the lines of communication open with anyone who wants to have input on this bill, and I know that those lines of communication remain open with concrete feedback and ways in which we can improve the text. That door is always open. We also really now want to move on to increasing the number of co-sponsors in the Senate. And so we will hopefully be reaching out to lots of the senators on the Judiciary Committee and beyond to sign on as co-sponsors. And we have lots of ideas about who those could be: folks who care deeply about VAWA, folks who have cared historically around about ending child marriage globally. So there are lots of targets on that front, and we're excited to see that co-sponsor number go up. And then, of course, the big next step is finding champions in the House and getting a companion bill introduced. And we have lots of exciting ideas about that too. And I will, with that, turn it over to Chastity to kind of have the final word here, if there's anything I missed or anything more you want to add.
No, it's just very exciting that we're able to have this conversation, clarify the different pieces of the bill. And like Casey said, please feel free to reach out to our office if you have questions about the bill. We're happy to keep those conversations going. We really want to build support. So if you're part of an organization that has not yet endorsed, we'd love to have a conversation with you about why you should. And then if you've already endorsed, please feel free to help us amplify the bill and how important of a step it could be in ending this practice. But we just really appreciate all the support that you all are willing to offer, and we're happy to keep talking about the different components of this bill. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chastity. And I think we are making good time. And I know that Alex was monitoring the Q&A. So Alex, if you want to unmute yourself, and if there are any questions in the Q&A box that I have not yet answered, I'm happy, and as is Chastity, to stay on and answer a few.
Yeah, thanks both. There's a couple questions that came in throughout. I think some of these were answered in the FAQ section, but I go through quickly. We have one question. I'm wondering if someone could give any example of what kind of scenario could result in a humanitarian waiver being granted, and what would be a consequence if if a waiver like this were not included in the bill.
Yeah, absolutely. Chastity, would you like me to take that, since, I definitely have several that come to mind.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks,
Tahari's
Casey.
work. Yeah, so I think most we'll take an example of something that's happened recently. I think many of us followed the really heartbreaking fall of Kabul after the US removed itself from Afghanistan. And in the chaos of that evacuation and displacement, many people were left behind. Some people got to the United States and some people didn't. What we know right now is that there is no presence in Afghanistan with the Department of State in order to process any visas from that country. And that applies to folks who might have been trying to seek a different kind of humanitarian pathway out of that country. We know that traveling throughout Afghanistan is incredibly dangerous. We know that trying to cross borders into places that do have a US presence is very difficult, and places like Pakistan and Qatar are hard to get to. And so what we know are that there are girls under Taliban rule in Afghanistan who are 16 or 17 whose spouses did make it out in the evacuation for whatever reason and are in the United States and could file for them. And, we wouldn't want them to be left behind. I think there are instances where people, maybe a 17 and a 19-year-old were married, and they're, in the United States, and one of them has status and the other one doesn't. Would we really want the, 17-year-old spouse of that 19-year-old person to be deported, potentially with no pathway back to the United States? Particularly if they're going to be deported to, let's imagine, a place like Sudan or Venezuela or Yemen. And so while we do like to imagine that there could be other humanitarian pathways or other visa pathways for these individuals, what we know right now are that many doors to immigration are closed, and they are particularly closed for survivors. And so when I think about a young girl, left behind in a refugee camp or in a conflict zone, because so many of our immigration laws do not center the experience of survivors or of women and girls, and potentially that her marriage might be her only pathway, I struggle to know what the right answer is. I do not want to be the arbiter of that necessarily right now until we know exactly what that can look like. And so we have put the humanitarian waiver, in the hands of the Secretary of Homeland Security to grant those as they see fit. And then we have the opportunity to look at that data after a year and say, maybe the need for this isn't what we thought it was. Maybe no one applied and nobody needs it and we can eliminate it. Maybe it was granted in situations where we're sort of scratching our heads. Maybe it was granted in situations where we're like, absolutely, yes, that makes perfect sense to us. Let's think about what our next steps will be. I don't know for sure how that's going to play out. What I know is that when we cannot guarantee that the unintended consequences will be worse than the status quo, we take caution, we listen to the experts in the immigration space, and we commit to revisiting it. So that's where I find comfort in the incremental approach in that space. I don't know, Chastity, if you want to add anything else.
Thank you. I have another question here, and this may just get to the difference between federal and state law and what can be done where, but I'll let you actually answer it. Is there a provision that would make emancipation of the minor simultaneous on granting a waiver and therefore marriage license for the 16 or 17-year-old?
Actually, Alex, I might turn that back to you since you are our in-house expert on state laws and emancipation laws. Right now, I think it would depend on the state that that person was entering into and whether or not married minors in that state are empowered with the rights of an adult. This, I think, is why Tahirih has been keen to preserve the rights of already married minors when we are changing age of marriage laws in states so that we don't strip already married minors of the rights that they have. So, I think that is probably a research task for a pro bono, but off the top of my head, that is what I can say. Alex, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I think the direct answer is there's nothing in the text of this bill that does or doesn't do that. I think it's just unaddressed. I believe the way that this bill is written, it would just sort of be determined by what exists in that state's current law.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate that being flagged for some more research. It's a good question.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions, Alex, before we wrap up?
One question on the timeline for advocacy for this bill. So if folks are interested in supporting it.
Thank you. Yeah, Chastity, I might invite you back in, but we are working with, we have pro bono lobby support. We have lots of groups. I'm getting texts now of, I've got relationships with these folks on the Hill. How can we get them involved? And I would look to the folks in Senator Durbin's staff to let us know sort of when it sounds like you want us to start, calling our senators and flagging this bill for them and encouraging them to sign on.
Yeah, so we're happy for that work to get started right now. I think, as everybody knows, there are some things coming up in the next couple of months that are going to keep Congress occupied. And so we have some time and some recess as well and some downtime to continue educating about the bill over the next few months and building that coalition of support. So we're working on it right now. Would appreciate any organization's assistance with working on it right now so that when we're ready to go and we have a path forward, then we are all set with all of the support that we need to move it forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think what Tahirih can work on is one of those sort of call to action. Click to email your senator to get them to support the bill. I think we want to be strategic around the timing. As you say, there are a lot of political distractions at the moment, but we certainly do want this to be on people's radar. We do want to get co-sponsors, especially from folks who might be obviously supportive, build that base of support. And again, if it doesn't past the finish line in this Congress, we are fully committed to reintroduction. Tahirih has been through those ropes before. There is legislation that we already know is sort of just a way for a congressperson to send a message, and there is legislation where the folks behind it are truly invested and they believe in the cause and they are committed to seeing it through. And this is one of those issues. And so I I think we're all fully committed to building support now, and it's we're all in it for the long haul until we see this bill pass the finish line. So excited that people are energized and hope that we can keep up that energy as we move forward. And as ever, the lines of communication always remain open. If there are ways that folks feel there are improvements to be made or clarity to be brought, I know that that the folks in Senator Durbin's office are always, you know, available to talk. Tahirih is always available to talk. This will be posted online, and we are excited to keep gathering support. Alex, is there anything else in the Q&A before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's one last one that I think this was briefly touched on during the FAQ section, but I think it's worth drawing out the details again for folks. It's just a question about the grants that are going to states in different scenarios. And, you know, basically the bill makes grant money available for states that have ended child marriage and states that have not ended child marriage. So what are the differences between those grants, and why, if we're giving money in either scenario, why is this an incentive to end child marriage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I threw around this STOP and SASP and violence against women. And so the bumps in grant funding to states that have already ended child marriage, kind of, I'll give sort of like if Tahirih were applying for a grant now that we're in Virginia and Virginia has ended child marriage, typically what this looks like is, you know, if states or organizations are applying for funding through sexual assault services, I forget what the P stands for in SASP. So funding through that grant stream, we will be able to check a box that says we operate in a state that has ended child marriage, and therefore we're eligible for sort of this percentage bump in the grant funding that we can apply for. So like the ceiling of the amount of money that states can apply for through those grant programs gets increased if they can say we are operating in a state that has ended child marriage, right? So there's always sort of limits on the amount of funding that each state gets from different grant streams through the Office of Violence Against Women, and those sort of limits would be raised, or you can also think about it as sort of like a cherry on top of whatever amount of money that they're eligible for if they're operating, you know, if those organizations that are applying for those grants through those grant streams are operating in a state that has ended child marriage. And so, you know, what an advocate in a state like Maryland, who has gotten close but not yet ended child marriage, could say is you could bring more funding to our state's domestic violence coalition, or our, you know, programs that are running shelters for survivors. We could get more money from the federal government into those programs if you would end child marriage. So that's sort of the mechanism of that incentive. The mechanism of the state task forces is sort of twofold. One is we can get money from the federal government to do this work, to make this local case, and we don't have to continue to run these campaigns. You know, we hear from organizations in states like Georgia and elsewhere that, you know, they're pulled in lots of different directions. The work to address, study, you know, run bills on child marriage is an unfunded sort of secondary passion of theirs. But with funding and a task force, we can get focused, funded efforts running on the state level. And one tool in their toolkit would be, if we do this, if we set the minimum age at 18, then we become eligible for this bump in STOP and SASP grants through the Office of Violence Against Women. So that incentive interacts with the state task forces, in that they can say in their recommendations, we recommend this for a myriad of reasons, mostly for preventing abuse and exploitation of young girls, but also if we do this, we get more money from the federal government to address violence against women in our state. Does that make sense, Alex? Do you feel like I've answered that?
Yeah, that made sense to
Okay.
me. Basically, the grants and the scenarios are for different things, both of which move towards ending child marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for summarizing things. Sometimes I can get a little in the weeds because I'm maybe too heads down on this these days. So I appreciate you bringing, like, you know, 10,000 foot level clarity there. Any other questions in the Q&A?
Nope, that was the last one.
Okay, well, Chastity, did you want to say one last sort of farewell to this group before we wrap up?
Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. And Casey, appreciate you and Alex leading an excellent presentation today.
Yeah, I appreciate you so much, Chastity. Please give our gratitude to Senator Durbin and Stephanie and others who have worked so hard on this. And thank you everyone today for your time. Thanks everyone who has reached out with questions. Challenges me to think better, think harder, think more clearly. I do appreciate it. It makes us all better. And I think we have gotten to an incredible place with this piece of legislation. And I'm excited to see it move forward. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.